the masses take his part, believe the lie to chill their hearts. They'll know the time has come to seal their fate. Those who cling to the cross will refuse and pay the cost. God redeems his own from the sea of hate. Which way will you choose? Which way will you choose? You've got everything to gain. You've got everything to lose.
There's a new effort underway to regulate every single financial transaction that occurs in this country through something called the Central Bank Digital Currency, CBDC. If that happens, we're done. They can control you with a flick of a switch. Now, what is central bank digital currency? Well, that's where all financial transactions are effectively controlled by the central bank, really by the government. So this appears to be coming in this country. Several banks have announced already that they're working with the Fed to implement a CBDC. Once again, if this happens, we're done. No more political debate. We will have unprecedented levels of regulation, of surveillance, and of control. We are starting to get a more precise sense of what it means when Joe Biden brags about the strongest and most equitable economic recovery in modern history. Yesterday, some of the biggest banks in this country, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, collectively lost more than $50 billion in market value in one day. That's quite a hit. On the other hand, those banks still exist, and you can't say that for Silicon Valley Bank. As of this morning, Silicon Valley Bank, or SVB, has gone under completely. That makes the second biggest bank failure in the history of this country. And it's significant. SVB financed nearly half of all venture-backed healthcare and technology companies in the United States. It also apparently held significant cash reserves for some of the biggest cryptocurrencies. And it's now gone. So the drama in the banking sector, the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, has a lot of Americans concerned about how to protect their money. And of course, politicians are using that concern to their advantage as always. Several states are now trying to centralize currency with a so-called central bank digital currency, which is, by the way, not currency at all. It's software. But they're going to do it for your own good. Obviously, this is a tool of total social control. If they control your money, if they can zero out your bank account with a keystroke, then you have no autonomy. They control you. Well, in the state of South Dakota, legislators just passed a bill that would have changed the definition of money to exclude cryptocurrency, and that would put the state on a path to centralized digital currency. South Dakota's governor, Kristi Noem, the only governor we're aware of who's paying attention to this, vetoed that bill. She joins us tonight to explain why. Why did you do it? You're obviously under pressure not to veto it, but you did. Why did you?
Well, Tucker, it was the right thing to do. I became aware of this bill. It wasn't introduced until almost halfway through our legislative session. We started reading through this bill that was over 110 pages long. It was sold as an update to the guidelines of the Universal Commercial Code, backed by all of our financial institutions, our banks. As we started reading through it, we saw the section of the bill that changed the definition of currency. And essentially what it did was pave the way for a government-led CBDC, and it also banned any other form of cryptocurrency or Bitcoin or digital currency that existed. So for me, it very clearly was a threat to our freedom. In South Dakota, we are the session that completes its business earliest in the year. We are the first ones to really look at this bill and find out the truth of what's in it. And I did veto that bill. I'm asking my legislators to change their minds, to make the right decision and help me kill this bill once and for all. But I'm telling you, Tucker, we've got the same language coming to over 20 other states. I believe it's to pave a way for the federal government to control our currency and thus control people. It should be alarming to everyone, and it's being sold as a UCC guidelines update. I find it ironic that we also are having this discussion at the same time we have banks and credit card companies talking about coding gun and ammunition in a separate code so they can track it. So not only can they tie these two issues together, if the government doesn't approve of what you're purchasing, if they have the only form of digital currency out there and that is endorsed and utilized in the country, they can control how you spend that money and thus take away all your freedom.
Do you think that legislators in your state understand what this bill was actually designed to do?
Yeah, I don't know if they read it, Tucker. That's what is alarming
Right.
to me is it was over 110 pages long, and they were told by lobbyists that they had listened to for the last 20 years that it's fine. It's just a regulation update. This is what we do, is adopt federal regulations. But if you start reading it, you see in there is a redefinition of currency, that it says government CBDCs are okay if they're run by the government, but any other form is then banned. It is clearly a change for how people's assets are utilized. It clearly limits the freedom of people to use other forms of currency that they may choose to if it is a digital currency. And it is clearly putting power into the hands of government. If anything we should have learned the last several years is the government can't be trusted.
Revelations 13, verse 16. And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads. 17. And that no man may buy nor sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name.
Take away cash and make everything digital, and digital currency is central bank digital currency. Obviously, you have no power whatsoever. If they don't like what you're doing, they just shut you down and you're impoverished. It just happened in Canada last winter, so we know what the consequences are, and we know why they want it. So that couldn't happen, right? Well, we may live to see the day that it does happen. And here's the latest sign that it may be happening. The number of banks and ATM machines in this country are in steep decline. Far fewer than there were just a few years ago. And in some countries like Australia, they're going away at high speed. So this is not something that anyone voted on. This is something that they're just doing, whether you like it or not. So you can say we have cash, but if you can't get cash, then do you really have cash? So where's this going? That's the question we want to assess tonight. And we're going to with Catherine Austin Fitts, who has been monitoring this. She founded the Solari Report. She's also the Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and we're happy to have her. If you put this up to a vote nationally, most people would say, no, I may not use cash, but I'd like to have cash, because if there's no cash, then I have no control over my life. But it seems like this could be a way to affect the same outcome without a vote.
Tucker, one of the bedrocks of freedom is freedom to do financial transactions, including privately, or freedom to do where you want to do and wherever you want to do. And unfortunately, as the financial system has become more and more digital, you see more and more not only invasive surveillance, but more and more controls. You referred to Canada, perfect example. The reality, as the financial system gets more controlling and more invasive, it's a little bit like bringing up a corral around us. And CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, and vaccine passports or digital IDs are sort of the last shutting of the gate. It's hard for many people to imagine the risks here because we're so used to living with financial transaction freedom, and we don't understand that when this gate closes on us, we literally will be sitting in a system where the central banks believe that our assets belong to them, and they can dictate where we can spend money and what we can spend money on. The important thing to understand is central bank digital currencies are not currencies. It's a financial transaction control grid, and it gives the ability for the central bankers, and they've said this publicly, the ability to not only set the rules centrally, but enforce the rules centrally. If you don't behave, you can have your money turned off. I think it's very hard for people who've grown up and enjoyed Western liberty and human liberty to imagine literally that we're going into a system where literally our homes, our cars, our communities become digital concentration camps.
Everything you do, everything you say, and everything you buy is controlled and evaluated by the authorities. It's not science fiction. In China, it's a reality. From now on, citizens' lives are rated and assessed. This is what the Chinese Communist Party calls social credit.
This is Richard Werner, the top academic scholar in the world on central banking. He wrote the book and did the documentary, The Princes of the Yen, about the Japanese central bank. Here he is in Malmo, Sweden, in May.
The nature of this CBDC, what is it actually going to look like? They never talk about that. Right. But I heard one European central banker tell me what it's going to look like. He saw it. He was invited to one of the old central banks in Europe that are very much promoting this. And they showed him. And, you know, he's a top, executive director of another central bank in Europe, and there's no reason to believe that he was telling me a story. And it was around this large, and would be implanted under your skin.
CBDC. If that happens, we're done.
So you might have missed what happened Wednesday afternoon at the Fed, but they started their CBDC.
So we know by reading the Word of God and in the book of Revelations that the Antichrist will control a one-world government, a one-world religion, and a one-world monetary system. Some of these prophecies have not been able to come to pass due to the technology not being created yet. This is why the prophet Daniel was told to seal up the words of this book until the time of the end.
On Friday, as you know, Silicon Valley Bank, SVB, failed. That became the second largest bank failure in American history. Then on Sunday, authorities took over Signature Bank in New York. That became the third largest bank failure in American history. Then today, shortly after the markets opened, trading in several regional banks had to be halted. Western Alliance was down almost 80%. First Republic, which of course Jim Cramer endorsed just a few days ago on CNBC, that was down nearly 70%. PacWest down 50%, Comerica down 40%, and so on. So there was panic, of course, reflected in markets, and it wasn't just regional banks that were affected. For a while this morning, you could not even trade stock in Charles Schwab, venerable Charles Schwab. Schwab down 25% and tripped a circuit breaker. That's bad. In fact, that kind of panic could quickly, conceivably become a catastrophe. So on the brink of catastrophe, you need one thing: strong, competent leadership. But we don't have that. We have Joe Biden. Today he shuffled out to the podium and announced a bailout.
I want to briefly speak about what's happening in Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank. Today, thanks to the quick action of my administration over the past few days, Americans can have confidence that the banking system is safe. Your deposits will be there when you need them. Small businesses across the country, the deposit accounts at these banks can breathe easier knowing they'll be able to pay their workers and pay their bills.
All right. So the money the Biden administration is using for this bailout apparently is coming from the FDIC. So the feds have it covered. Don't worry about the details. Everything's totally fine. Hold on. Slow down, pal. How did this happen? Can we get an explanation for that? Don't we have regulators? And how did those regulators, since we're pretty confident they exist, aren't taking big salaries, how did they miss the fact that SVB was insolvent apparently for months, and not in some complex credit default swap way you're going to spend 5,000 words trying to understand, but in a really simple way that's easy to understand? Their liabilities were bigger than their assets. It's very simple. How did nobody notice that? The people were paid to notice it. Well, Joe Biden unfortunately answered none of those questions. He just ran for the door.
Thank you. God bless you, and may God protect our troops. See you in California.
Mr. President, what do you know right now about why this happened? And can you assure Americans that there won't be a ripple effect?
Do you expect other banks to fail, Mr. President?
Should all depositors be protected at all banks? All right, thank you, everybody.
Okay. Do we know why this happened? He's trying to figure out how to work the doorknob. What we know is the Biden administration is backstopping these deposits. Okay. But that's not the end of the story. In some ways, it's the beginning. So here's the part where you pause and ask yourself a question that too few seem to be considering right now. What are they going to get in return? Oh, something, for sure. Remember that after 2008, the Obama administration, Eric Holder, swooped in and imposed DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion standards on the entire financial sector. And that's one of the main reasons our big banks are now increasingly incompetent, and also one of the reasons Americans are so divided by race. Ideologues used the 2008 bank bailout to kill American meritocracy. That's a big step, mostly unacknowledged, but we're living with its consequences. So you have to ask yourself, what are they going to do this time? Well, we know we're about to see bank consolidation, big banks eating little banks, and that means less competition. More consolidation means more government control. So what are they going to do with that control? Well, all things being equal, if people don't start making a lot of noise and exerting an awful lot of pressure, it'll mean digital currency, a currency that politicians control. Sign up for the CBDC app to get your food stamps. You think that's not coming? Of course it's coming. They'd like it to come in any case. Now, we're not alleging a conspiracy here. But we did notice that the four biggest banks, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, JP Morgan, Chase, are doing well. And we also noticed that the White House appears to be, maybe we're just reading into this too much, trying to induce runs on regional banks. They seem to be trying to take away your confidence in those banks. Here's Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, not someone we'd ever accuse of having an original thought, but she's a vessel for the plans of others. Here she is on Friday as SVB was collapsing. Now, she doesn't say a word about the fundamentals of the market or the security of your money in banks. Instead, she talks about the one thing that matters to her, which is the racial identity of the people in charge of our finance.
I do want to take a moment to note the historic nature of the moment that you see in front of you right now. All three of us are historic first in our roles. The first Black woman to serve as CEA chair, OMB director, White House press secretary, the first Black women right in front of you for all of those three important key roles in the administration.
These people lack all self-awareness, as if anyone would care. Why should we care? Is there some reason to care? And by the way, you are discrediting by your stupidity and clear incompetence anything you're promoting. You should keep that in mind. But big picture, if you wanted to make people less confident in regional banks and the banking system more broadly, if you wanted to maybe induce a run on the banks, this might be how you'd talk. Oh, we're all of a certain racial group. Huh? What does it have to do with whether the banks have enough cash in reserve to cover their balance sheets? So what we do know is that the Democratic Party, the Biden administration, sees this crisis as a means of expanding their control. And we know this because in a recent Zoom call with the Fed, Treasury Department, and other financial regulators, with members of Congress, Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona asked whether there was a program in place to censor social media posts that could lead to a national run on banks. Now, that's according to Congressman Thomas Massie. So think about this for a second. You've got a deposit at a regional bank that's holding tons, way more than you know, of long-term treasuries that are worth a lot less than they were when the bank bought them. That means that bank is at risk. That means your money's at risk. But Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona doesn't want you to know about that. Why wouldn't they want you to know that? Kind of interesting. That kind of censorship could actually crush people. So we have to ask the obvious question, how close are we to some sort of disaster? And to what extent are the people in charge abetting it?
So actually, I think that this is a game that is a downward march. Just like ESG came out of the 2008 financial crisis, central bank digital currencies are what's going to come out of this next one. And I think that this is something that every Republican, frankly, every American needs to be clear about. We have to say absolutely not to that level of social credit scoring that could unfold on the back of this. And you mark my words, it's marking yours as well. This is likely where this is heading. It's a longer-term game to a disaster.
Well, we know we're about to see bank consolidation, big banks eating little banks, and that means less competition. More consolidation means more government control. So what are they going to do with that control? Well, all things being equal, if people don't start making a lot of noise and exerting an awful lot of pressure, it'll mean digital currency, a currency that politicians control. Sign up for the CBDC app to get your food stamps. You think that's not coming? Of course it's coming.
Cancel culture is good for democracy. Well, that's the opinion of people who believe that freedom of speech only applies to particular points of view. Now, a new movement is underway to blacklist certain speech by labeling it disinformation. The goal is to convince companies to stop advertising on conservative websites.
Companies are being steered away from spending advertising dollars with conservative news websites by what's been labeled a stealth blacklisting operation. The British Global Disinformation Index says its mission is to disrupt the business model of disinformation. To reduce disinformation, we need to remove the financial incentive to create it. The index has the potential to economically strangle some conservative websites. Investigative reporter Gabe Kaminsky uncovered the operation for the Washington Examiner.
GDI compiles a secretive dynamic exclusion list, essentially a blacklist, of the websites that it determines to be the biggest purveyors of disinformation online.
The Global Disinformation Index lists the 10 riskiest websites for companies to advertise with. All are conservative or libertarian, including the New York Post, Reason, the Daily Wire, and the American Conservative. They're accused of things like lack of transparency, bias, or omissions of pertinent information. We asked the senior editor at the American Conservative, Rod Dreher, for his response to the claim his website is risky.
My response is, we are an opinion magazine. Of course we're biased. Liberal opinion magazines are biased too.
But no liberal or mainstream media websites are listed as risky by the Index, which is funded by several foundations, including George Soros' Open Society Foundations, and even the U.S. government through the National Endowment for Democracy. Or at least it was until members of Congress got wind and the funding was canceled. This is only the latest wave of cancel culture to hit conservatives, who have already been shadow banned, deplatformed, debanked, and even mentioned for deprogramming.
And the question is, how are we going to really almost deprogram these people?
As conservatives began to be banned from social media, they thought that at least they would be safe on their own websites. But the censors have followed. While Republicans in Congress are vowing to investigate the Global Disinformation Index, Dreher, the author of The Benedict Option, a strategy for Christians in a post-Christian nation, does not believe this censorship campaign will stop anytime soon.
Yeah, I don't think it ever will stop, because the other side, they're motivated by a religious fervor. They are fighting evil, and you can't tolerate evil. They have identified the enemy. The enemy are those who are so-called deplorables, including conservative Christians and others, who they will deem to be threats, and therefore they can be marginalized.